Texts in the City brings classic texts to life for students, teachers and lifelong learners. Our book for this episode is Brooklyn by Colm Tóibín.
I mean, it's since the whole purpose of the novel almost is to be anti-heroic, that we've had enough heroes, you know, and to have someone who's not heroic, who's not able for life in certain ways, and it's easy to push her around. And to have someone like that as the protagonist of a book, even though she might frustrate the reader who thinks what should she do? No, she's not going to do that, actually. She's going to go back to her room and be very, very quiet.
When I wasn't sure how to pronounce Colm Tóibín, and I thought it was Tóibín, I went online and he was having an interview with the Radio National program, and the first question asked of him was, how do you pronounce your name? And he said, well, it's toe as in toe and bean as in bean, Tóibín. And then I listened more closely, and as he started to talk about the novel, he said Eilish.
Well, yes. Well, I googled it too, and there are about half a dozen different pronunciations of her name, and I ended up looking at a site called, I think this is right, although you probably will think it's so irrelevant to look up, irishbabynames.com, and it rhymes with my wish, so it's Eilish, which is a really beautiful... The first time I read it, I was just going Ellis, because it seemed to be the easiest way of doing it. And in fact, if I slip into that today, I apologise. It's not the right pronunciation. But Eilish is such a beautiful name.
It is, and so what we know, if nothing else, about this book, we know how to pronounce the author's name and the main character. I want to start by looking at some great interviews, by the way, with the author. If you haven't done so already on YouTube, there are some really great conversations that he has with people here in Australia and overseas. One of the things that he talked about, which is obviously a key to the book, in his opinion, he said migration is the history of Ireland. And he said, obviously, people know things such as the potato famine. There's many books being written about the Troubles, various forms of sectarian violence and confrontation in Ireland. But he said there is not a family in Ireland that hasn't been touched directly by migration. In other words, in every family there's a story of loss. There's a story of someone who left and went away, and often were never heard of again. So very few people returned, and so there's this sort of sense of absence and loss for a family member in Irish history. But one of the things that Corrie and I were corresponding over this in the last few days was something that Corrie wanted to talk about and raise was what was the catalyst, though, for the novel. And you had a very, I think, interesting understanding of that through something you'd read about Tóibín.
Look, many of you, first of all, as Tony said, read as many online interviews as you can with the author, and also download interviews. In fact, he did a terrific one at the Wheeler Centre not so long ago, and it's easily accessible on your computer. The other thing I would urge you to do, and it will probably only take you about an hour, but read a brief history of Ireland, north and south, and as a complete picture. Because as Tony said, the spectre of migration has hung over this country for centuries and centuries. And in fact, at the time that the book is written, in the 1950s, 500,000 people left Ireland at that time. Most of them went to England. As you say, a sense of loss. And also, just another point to really reflect upon is that in the gold rush era, for example, which was the first wave of Irish migration to Australia, a lot of English people and Scottish people came to the colonies as well. A number of them went back with this newfound wealth. The Irish tended to stay because there wasn't a lot to go back to. So it is really kind of interesting thinking about our own connection here in Australia with Irish history and Irish migration. But in an interview, which again I would urge you to have a look at, Malcolm Knox, who is a writer and wrote a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald in 2010, did a terrific profile of Colm Tóibín. I pronounce it Tóibín. I'm going to have to keep saying it because I can't. Tóibín. He write. I'll just quote Malcolm because it's a rather beautiful sort of couple of paragraphs. Soon after September 11, 2001, Colm Tóibín managed to offend one of his audience while speaking at the New York Public Library. Quote, "I said that when I looked at photographs of the firefighters who went into Twin Towers, their faces looked to me like Irish faces," Tóibín recalls. "I hadn't yet learned how careful outsiders have to be when talking about race in America, and I'd put my foot in it. Someone stood up and said aggressively, 'What do you mean by Irish faces?' Causing offence would not come easily to Tóibín, a notoriously affable Irishman. He had to think on his feet. Quote, "I started saying, 'A man whose eyes are soft but his mouth is stubborn. A man who loves and hates with seriousness but doesn't talk about them. A man who's bad at working for himself but good at working for others. A man who's better with his daughters than he is with his sons.'" While speaking, Tóibín also began to ask himself, what is the equivalent Irish woman going to be like? The question was the seed from which she would grow Eilis Lacey, the heroine of Brooklyn, Tóibín's 12th book and 6th novel. Eilis's story, told with aching restraint, tugs her between a claustrophobic family life in Enniscorthy in the 1950s and a new existence across the Atlantic in Brooklyn.
One of the things that in our exchanges is that I think you have a very strong sense that he does tap so successfully into Eilis's inner world. Now, she could be, one reading, and I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate here, as an overtly passive character. How do you think he does tap into her inner world, and what it is through the sort of unspokenness of her and her sense of dutifulness, perhaps, that you think he captures so well?
Well, some people might read Brooklyn and think, oh, it's a book about migration, or it's a book about place, Brooklyn, the Irish village, and then Brooklyn. In fact, for me, it is a story about a woman's inner world. It's an old-fashioned style literary device, I think, that he employs here, which is very much the third-person narrator, subjectively watching the world, but with an objectivity that allows the reader to really get in there. Because as the character is exploring her feelings, new places, fear and the trauma that comes with migration when you're on your own especially, she actually takes the reader on the journey because she's exploring how she feels.
I think the novel lends itself to it in one way, in a way that the stage or the film don't, in that you can actually capture one thing that's going on in someone's mind and one thing that's going on in the world, and they're not the same thing, even though they probably should be, and that they create a gulf between them which sort of feeds on itself, and that you can actually play with that in the novel.
When do you think the psychological shift occurs that gives her some confidence to return a little more assured than she was when she left?
Well, I suppose we all go through it, don't we? If you, go back to your old neighbourhood, or if you, when you're a kid, your parents have their best friends and you have lots of barbecues and you do things with, the other family in your life, and then maybe you don't see each other for a few years, or you don't see the parents, and you walk into the room as an assured older teenager, and the last time they saw you was a little kid, and they don't just say, oh, how you've grown, which is obvious because you have, but they really, like, you've changed, you've grown. What they mean grown, they mean you've evolved, and there's that wonderful feeling, I think, when you're on the receiving end of all these compliments, is that you kind of feel a bit chuffed that, I have changed, I am different.
She's partly based on myself, in that I think anyone who comes down in a family, who's not the oldest, like I'm fourth in a family of 5, so no matter where I ever go, what I ever do, I can be just pushed around, and I feel psychologically that I'm the person who, I'm always trying to catch up with the others, and if someone is reading, they're turning the page before I have finished it. You know what I mean? And so to that extent, I'm using things I know from childhood or from adolescence, or perhaps even still. That I had aunts where the older one would have been more powerful than the other one, and I would have watched all that. But a lot of it is invention as well.
It is interesting that because she sleeps with Tony soon after Rose has died, and she has this sense of guilt about it. But it does reflect what might be seen as a bad decision. In fact, is that people often respond to death, even though she may be in shock, with a real intensity, an emotional and physical intensity. And some people may find themselves, in fact, removing themselves from physical contact with other people, but some people are drawn to a need, almost insatiable need for physical contact. I thought he wrote that scene with real subtlety, but at the same time there was a real intensity emotionally to it. I mean, some of the contrasts that I picked up, and they're pretty straightforward, is obviously tradition versus modernity. There's the notion of Miss Kelly's terribly oppressive corner shop and the department store, which again is all about modernity. There's a sort of economic stagnation of Ireland in the post-war period, whereas there's the potential for economic opportunities in New York. And there's also this notion of a closed or very small community of the town she grows up in, as opposed to, again, some sense of independence and individual expression when she moves to New York. And, of course, there's that notion of the monoculture of the small town to the cosmopolitan as the big city. Now, they seem like absolute contrast, but one of the things that interested me was the figure of the priest, of Father Flood, because while with the move to New York there is this sense of dramatic change, you still have this sort of subtle, but this sort of patriarchal control or a sort of a sense of his patronage overseeing everything. It's almost that a bit of the old world has to go with her, or a bit of the old world has to go with the Irish migrant, and you try in a sense to replicate something of the old country in the new world, but it doesn't quite hold, because I think this is clear in the scene when he holds that Christmas party, and he's holding it for all those people who have come to the new world expecting prosperity and have never found it. So it's not so clear, those contrasts, or that there's a sort of breakdown of...
I wondered in that scene how many of them had he been responsible for bringing out, and was he in fact feeling guilty? But look, I did not like him at all until the moment when he can really, really read her homesickness in a very intuitive and, I think, caring and loving way. But I hated the way he and Rose hatched the plan without even talking to Eilish about it. And I wondered whether he had a bit of a crush, or he was kind of in awe of Rose's... Clearly she was a charismatic person. Isn't it funny how somebody's not in a novel for a lot of the time, but they really, their presence is really felt there. It's really strong. I love a novel that does that. It's kind of like the character that's off screen but is constantly there. I'm
going to read a statement which is a claim about the ending of the book, and I want you to respond. I love the ending, by the way, and it in the end becomes so moving, and it really does creep up on you. But this is from some notes about Brooklyn. So Eilish returns to New York, but no more as a result of her own decision than when she originally embarked. The novel ends on a decidedly sombre note, with Eilish imagining her mother informing Jim Farrell that her daughter has gone back to Brooklyn. The final image of the novel is Eilish on the train, taking her forever away from both the home and the man she genuinely loves. The unmistakable sense of a second forced departure, this time far more painful than the first, evokes a type of personal renunciation that casts a retrospective shadow over the preceding action and positions Eilish as a figure of authentic sorrow. Now, one is, I don't know that she loves Jim Farrell more than she loves Tony. You can love two people at the same time, but the fact that it's more painful than the first. My sense of reading it was when she went to Miss Kelly's shop and she informed Eilish not only that she had a photo taken with Jim, and
she was onto her.
She was onto her, but to me there's a realisation that there's no privacy in this town. It's so claustrophobic. Everybody knows. It to me, it's almost like part of it is running away. That she realised going back would also bring with it this closed community that she eventually also needs to leave.
What are your thoughts on Georgina, the lady Eilish meets on the sea liner? how does she influence the new change?
Well, I think don't you think she gives Eilish a bit of courage? I think she makes Eilish quite curious about what's ahead of me, meeting new people. I don't know. What did you think, Tony?
Well, it's interesting because she's a little bit abrupt when she first enters the room, but she's much more forward, and she's very streetwise, world-wise. I think the other thing that she might stand for is in the sense that she is very cosmopolitan in the sense of going backwards and forwards often. And I think what she's conveying to us is that we don't know what her character was like before she meets Eilish on the ship, but we certainly know that she's experienced. So through that experience, there's a confidence and a real strength in her. She's a bit sort of...
And she sort of says, I liked the contrast, Eilish has come from kind of closeted conversations where people don't really say what they really think. Indeed, her family plots to send her overseas without telling her. So that's a pretty big secret. And then she meets Georgina, who's quite open, and that to me was a nice contrast between what was and what can be. So I think she's what you might call like the metaphor, of travelling across the ocean with this kind of person is actually a really good one.
And there's also a notion that she does give Eilis that moment of protection and support because she's in a terrible situation. She's worrying about if the smell and the mess she's made.
It is just a hideous scene.
Just a sense of embarrassment. She makes her feel at ease. And I think that even though she's a bit of a rougher character, there's something quite maternal about her as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something quite composed and classy, if you like, about Eilish. I think she's a deeply sensitive thinking person. We know that from the way Tóibín writes about her observations of things and her feelings of things. She's a deep thinker, and I think she has sort of a natural quality that people recognise. So Miss Kelly knows that she's above the other shop girls. The boarding house lady knows that Dolores isn't really going to survive for too long if she doesn't have Eilish on her arm when they go to the dance together. I think people do probably as she grows older, Eilish actually becomes one of those really wise, wonderful women to whom people turn for advice, comfort. She's very genuine. She's a really genuine. She's an unexpected heroine, I think.
Is there a threat to that though? Because there is clearly, going back to Brooklyn and going back to Tony, she might be able to go and watch the Brooklyn Dodgers and go dancing, but she could end up on a quarter acre in Long Island having children. So clearly going back, even though we see growth, and I think we both agree, strength in her, there's a potential for that to be stifled.
Well, I thought that she'd go back and she'd run the family building company and do all the books and they'd make a fortune. That's what I thought. Yeah, well, that's what I thought. Because she'd really, when she's offered the job back in Enniscorthy, which just comes sort of out of the blue, and they're really, like the chap, I can't remember his name, but he acknowledges her bookkeeping skills and everything. It's another sort of boost of her confidence, which she's already been receiving with these terrific results and everybody saying, you'll be promoted and you'll go here and you'll go there. And I think she probably does come back a deeply empowered person to the point where probably, she goes back to married life and she says, we're going to do something about this. We're going to take the business in hand. That's how I kind of feel.
I mean, it's interesting. I've never read many novels where bookkeeping is dealt with so poetically, but it's not something, certainly not to be dismissed, because she says, I don't make mistakes. She's so good at what she does. But, of course, by going to Brooklyn, there is uncertainty. There is risk. And so it's not like you can add up these figures, you can get an answer and you don't make mistakes. She could make a mistake, and I think, again, it goes to her sense of courage that there is an unknown. She can't go back and with absolute certainty, and it's a very different process she's involved in psychologically than her ability to make sure the figures are right, which I think there's real meaning in that for our understanding of her as a character.